Thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here from here. I was excited to be with you in DC, but as Florian mentioned, I had a skiing accident. So I've been hobbling around a bit and have a surgery coming up. So thank you for allowing me to join virtually. I'm excited to share some things with you all today. So just a quick a little agenda here about what we're going to be going over. So the need for user research. Why do we even care? Why do we want to consider user research? And then we'll go into usability and specifically usability testing in surveys, what that means. What is that definition? What does that look like for us? And then I have some tips for you all, some tips on survey design, some tips for survey questions. I'm sure there are many of you in the room who are familiar with some of these concepts, but there's some that I just really like to drive home. So I'll be sharing those with you. Now, I know Florian mentioned a bit already about my background. Thank you so much. That was so kind. I wanted to share a little bit too, just about my background and where I'm coming from and why I'm excited and passionate about this work here. I've been in user experience research now for a little over 20 years, and I started at the Census Bureau. It was during my postdoc. I was an intern at the Census Bureau, and then I was a postdoc at the Census Bureau in the usability lab. And that was really where I got into usability, which later became user experience. User experience is still relatively new in our field, but usability testing is what we talk about, that specific methodology. And I learned all about it at the Census Bureau in the usability lab. And that's also where I got really interested and got a lot of experience in surveys, of course, being the Census Bureau. From there, I moved on to lots of organizations. I was at Forest Marsh Group in the DC. So again, I was in the DC area. I was excited to be with you all in person. I love going back to DC. And moved on from there to some of these other organizations, Facebook, Instagram, Google, Bridgewater Associates, where I brought that experience of surveys along with me, even though these weren't necessarily survey companies. But I continued to conduct a lot of research using surveys, teaching colleagues how to conduct really great surveys. So it's been my thing. It's kind of like my survey methodology friends know me as a usability user experience person, and my UX friends know me as a survey person. So I've had this really nice intersection. And then additionally, through all these different companies, I've done a lot of work with privacy. So that's like another kind of piece of my puzzle. And then as Florian mentioned, I recently converted into full-time training, coaching, and that's been really exciting. And surveys just continue to be a part of my world. I teach a lot, and I teach a lot about survey design and survey creation. Emily Geisen and I got together a few years back, and we published a book, Usability Testing for Survey Research. We noticed this gap. Like, there's a lot of literature around survey design and survey questions. And then in the usability world, in the UX world, there are books about how to conduct usability testing. But we noticed this gap, that there really wasn't an intersection of the two. So we got together and we published that book. If it's something you're interested in usability testing, I promise you it's super usable. It's a great little book to keep around to help guide you along how to conduct usability testing properly. But of course, here I am to tell you a little bit more about that today too. So let's get into user research. So why is it even important? Why do we care about user research? So ultimately, this isn't rocket science. It's really important to understand our users' experience, because you're not necessarily your user. And it's really impossible to know how people use our products, our surveys, our supplementary materials that come with our surveys, any of these things, without actually going and talking to them. It's impossible to know how other people interact with our products, how they feel, what's going on, when there are problems, why there are problems, if we don't actually go out and talk to people. So it's important, because ultimately we are not them. So let's take, for example, these are actually some engineers that I worked with at Instagram in New York City. So here they are sitting at their office in New York City, creating products for everyone. And it's really impossible for them to know how everyone uses these products. So let's say this particular app is aimed at helping people during emergencies, and it helps them connect with other people, and it helps them share resources. And let's imagine Sue, the engineer in New York City. She's never been in such a crisis, in such an emergency. But let's say she can imagine what it's like to experience an earthquake because she's had friends who experience earthquakes, her friends in San Francisco. And maybe she can imagine what it's like to be in a flood because she's seen these on the news. She's seen floods on the news. But can she really know what it's like to be in a flood? Can she really know what it's like to be in that situation and know what it's like to use an app during a flood or to complete a form to apply for assistance when everything is gone? Everything she's ever owned is gone from a flood. Can she really know what's important during a flood? And how about during a tornado? Can Sue really know what it's like to live through a tornado, to know what's important, who to contact, what information to share, what information is needed right after a crisis like this occurs? It's impossible to imagine what people's needs are, what people's experiences are without actually talking to them. And now imagine using a feature phone. So many of us are used to these computers in our hand, right? Our smartphones of today are these little computers, but now imagine using a feature phone. And now imagine you need to apply for assistance, complete a survey, complete a form during a crisis. Now it's really impossible for an engineer or, somebody a designer to imagine what that's even like. And what about if Sue is in an environment where people lose power for weeks and after one of these emergencies, and now they don't have any power and they need to apply for some sort of assistance? How about being in a culture where people don't like to connect? And now we're creating these products on our smartphones. We're creating surveys and websites and apps and all these things. But what about cultures where people don't like to connect? Or a company who doesn't want their employees to connect during the workday. So people leave their phones at their desk and they don't use them during meetings or throughout the day. And how about people who have low literacy or brand new smartphone users? All of these things are really impossible for Sue, the engineer in New York City, to imagine. But meanwhile, she's creating these products for people. Now, there's a lot of research that goes into clients and how to sell things to clients and how to market so people will buy products, but it's not enough. I love this little example here. So take, for example, a baby mobile that is marketed to the parents of the babies. And this makes sense because it's the parents who are going to purchase this mobile. And their view of the product is great. They could see these different zoo animals and they're spinning around, the faces and the bodies are rotating and there's music and it's really lovely. And the parents love this baby mobile. But were the user's needs taken into account? Was any research conducted from the baby's point of view, lying in the crib while the animals rotate overhead? You can guess where this is going. Whoops, skip that one. There we go. So I think not. So the baby ends up seeing these little animals' butts and tails rotating in a circle. So it's a completely different view from what the parents are seeing. So while there's a lot of research that goes into selling to clients and how to market products, it's not the same thing as a user's perspective and understanding users' needs. So don't forget about your users. You don't want this to happen with products you're working on, products you're creating, where a lot of work is going into understanding our clients and selling to our clients, but not necessarily into what the user's experience is. Now you can imagine for many of us, this might pertain to business surveys or business products as a whole, where there's somebody else who's making the purchasing decision. That is not the same person as the person who's actually using the product, completing the form, completing the survey, whatever the product is. So just keep that in mind that the two are different. We oftentimes forget this. Now, oftentimes when research is cut, organizations will use what I call Band-Aids to later attempt to fix an issue. And early research can really help to avoid these kinds of Band-Aids. So take, for example, an actual ticket machine. This is an actual ticket machine that I encountered in a parking garage. And I was trying to leave the parking garage and encountered this mess. And I had to figure out exactly what to do. I had to figure out exactly how to use this machine so I could simply pay and leave the parking garage. Clearly, research was not conducted on this machine ahead of time. So what happened here is the company had to use these Band-Aids to make this product more usable and intuitive, if you will, to users. But I don't know about you, all the Band-Aids in the world here, all the instructions aren't helping to make this a better product. And you can see they tried a number of things. They've added numbers, they've added additional instructions, they've added highlighting that corresponds to A, B, C, D. You know, it's just like a great big mess here, but it certainly didn't make it any easier for people to use the product, which in this case, it's a pretty straightforward thing. It's paying, sticking the ticket in, paying for parking, so then you can leave the parking garage, but they made it more difficult. And I would like to believe that this was a isolated incident, but this has kind of become a hobby of mine now. This is an actual same thing, an actual machine to leave a parking garage. And you can see they did the same thing. They added step 1, step 2, look at step 2. Please read the steps for payment. So it's like Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid to try to make this easier to use. And it certainly doesn't help. And then what happens is, let's see, hopefully this works okay. What happens is people will try to do the things. This is saying press for ticket, although it's way down here, push for ticket. Oops. Here's another one, another example of a machine to exit a parking lot. This one has something over here. Does that interact with the ticket machine? Again, there's numbers, there's lots of things going on here. And, you know, this is what ends up happening. People try to interact with this machine that should be really straightforward, and it's just not. And now imagine the stress that can occur if you've got a line of cars behind you. You've just had a stressful situation. You might be going to a stressful situation. You're trying to get out of this parking lot, and all you're trying to do is simply pay or here use the card to actually get out of the parking garage. So it could be really stressful. It could be really problematic to you, to those around you, to your users who are trying to do a really, really simple task. So when research is forgotten up front and companies use these Band-Aids, it's really not helpful for the end user. So why should we care? Why do we care about user research? Well, it's important. Understanding the way you do things, the way we do things, understanding you, yourself, the people around you and your clients, it's just simply not enough. We really need to go and talk to our users, our actual users. Okay, so let's talk about usability testing and how we actually work to understand our users and understand their experiences. Love starting with a classic definition. So the ISO defines usability as the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction in a specified context of use. Now let's take that apart a little bit. So a product. What is this product? In usability, we are working with a product. That often refers to a website, an app, in our work world, a survey, but a product can really be anything. When you think about conducting usability testing, really usability testing can be conducted on anything. It could be conducted on a pen. And we want to understand the extent to which this product can be used by specified users. Now, this part is important. Specified users. So who are the actual target users of our product? It wouldn't make sense to test the way this product, this pen, works with a baby, because babies presumably are not using this product, the pen. So we want to make sure when we're doing usability testing that we're working with our specified users, the people who are actually using the product, the target product. This comes up a lot in usability testing of surveys, where people will assume you can just grab colleagues and conduct usability testing with them. But this is different from QA testing, where we're looking for bugs and things like that. This is testing a product with the target users. So we want to recruit people who are as close as possible to our representative users of our surveys. And then we want to test whether or not people, adults in this example, can use that product, this specific product, to do a specific goal, which in this case would be writing. And then we measure that goal in specific ways. We measure effectiveness, which is how well it can be done. So can people actually do it? Can they actually write using the instrument? Efficiency, so how quickly can they do the thing? How quickly can they pick up that pen and write? And satisfaction. So what is the overall feeling? What is the overall experience of doing this thing, of doing this goal? And then the last part of the definition, in a specified context of use, this part is really important too. So what we wouldn't do is test if adults can use this pen to write in a swimming pool, because presumably that's not where people are actually using pens. What we want to do instead is set up an environment, set up a usability testing environment where we have a situation that is similar to what is in the real world. So we might sit them down at a desk. We might have them use a piece of paper, and we might then see if they can use this specific product, this pen, to write on that piece of paper. So what does this mean for surveys? In surveys, when we think about usability testing, it's important to think about these different components. So our products are often going to be our surveys, obviously. So that could be our web surveys, that could be paper surveys. Could also be websites. So at the Census Bureau, a lot of my work was around data dissemination websites. It could be websites that are supplementary to our surveys. It could be supplementary materials, some papers that come with the surveys, the letter that invites people to participate, some other supplementary materials. And of course, could be apps these days. Could be a lot of different things, but that's, think broadly when you think about what the product is that we're testing. Our users are usually our respondents. They could be our interviewers if we're testing how interviewers interact with the survey. And if they can properly use the survey and record responses, then that's important too. But oftentimes we are conducting usability testing with our respondents. And we want to make sure when interviewers aren't present, that respondents can actually use the product, which in surveys, that means, let's go down to goals. That means being able to provide correct and accurate opinions, stories, facts, predictions, whatever it is our questions are. We want to make sure people can accurately record their responses. That is the goal. And then context of use. So again, the same way we don't want to test the pen in a swimming pool where people aren't using it, we want to make sure when we're conducting usability testing of surveys that we're testing in a similar environment as to where people are actually completing the survey. So usually this means in people's homes, in people's offices, maybe when they're out and about. If it's the type of survey that people would receive when they're in line at a store, then that's the kind of environment you want to set up when you're conducting your usability study. If it's the kind of survey that people just get a ping when they're in the middle of doing something, then you want to mimic that kind of experience when you're testing the survey. And then when we think about effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction, effectiveness is completing those questions, the actual survey, making sure people can actually do that correctly, accurate answers. Efficiency, we want to make sure people are doing this as quickly as possible. Remember, people are busy. When we are asking people to complete surveys, usually they're doing something for us, right? People, maybe all of us really enjoy taking surveys, completing surveys, but usually we're asking people to give us their time and to complete our surveys. So we want to make sure that's as quick and painless as possible, as few steps, as few clicks as possible, making it a really efficient experience. And then satisfaction, I don't know, again, maybe those of us in the room are a little bit different where we enjoy surveys and we might actually experience some satisfaction. But usually in surveys, we talk about satisfaction really being a pleasant experience. It's not a bad experience. That's really what we want to make sure we're not giving people. We don't want to give people a bad experience. We want them to be, generally satisfied or just neutral, really, where they're not really experiencing any negative emotions. One early study an early study that I conducted usability testing on was the non-response follow-up enumerator questionnaire at the Census Bureau. And this is for people who do not respond to the census. An enumerator will show up at your doorstep and ask you these questions so you can be included in the census. And here, the product is the actual survey. So this was a tri-fold double-sided survey. That was one of the products we were testing. Now we had people come into the lab, people who would be, in this case, it was the interviewer, because that's the user of this product. This doesn't come in the mail and people fill it out at home without an interviewer present. For this survey, an interviewer shows up at your doorstep and conducts the survey. So our users here would be the type of person who would be an interviewer, and that's who we recorded. Now we had them come out to the Census Bureau in the lab, and we set up the context of use. So because a interviewer would show up at your doorstep and be holding all of these materials, we wanted to actually mimic that. And here's 4 different screenshots of people in the lab. You can see they're holding the materials in their hand while they're conducting the survey. This was really important. This was an important part of this survey, of this study design. We noticed that participants in the study would try to put some things down on the table, and we would remind them it's really important to hold them we didn't instruct them too much because we wanted to see what they would do. You know, do they put it down on the floor? But they wouldn't have a table next to them when they're out at somebody's home. So we would remind them of that context of use. We reminded them of the kind of situation they would be in when they were administering this survey. And then I mentioned supplementary materials. So for this particular survey, there are some supplementary materials, this information sheet that the enumerator, the interviewer, the user, could present to the person they're interviewing at the doorstep. So that we wanted to make sure this was clear. So we had a number of different things we were testing here. For this, we created, for our scenarios, we created some unique scenarios where it wasn't just typical easy to record populations, but we had some mix of various components that you see here on the information sheet. And we wanted to see if the user, who is the interviewer, if they could accurately record these unique situations. So we were testing a bunch of different things. It wasn't as simple as just, you know, here's the survey, please complete it as you normally would, but we had to set up that context of use. We had to tell them where to stand so we can have that camera pointing down, and tell them to imagine they were standing on somebody's doorstep. And then we had these supplementary materials. Now, people always ask me about cognitive testing. No, not people, survey methodologists, because survey methodologists are accustomed to cognitive testing. And I think it's important to spend a second on here to differentiate the two, usability versus cognitive testing. The simple way to think about it is usability is, can people use it, right? It's usability. How do people use it? And we're measuring behavior when we think about usability testing, when we're conducting usability testing. Cognitive testing, on the other hand, is, do people understand it? How do they understand it? And in cognitive testing, we are often probing on what terms and phrases mean to people. The survey screenshot that's on the screen here was from a Facebook privacy study that I worked on, where we wanted to understand how important it was for people to control various things, lots and lots of things you can control on Facebook. So there was the stem of the question, the main part of the question was, how important is it for you to control who can see each of the following? And then there were a number of items, such as your birth month and day, your birth year, your phone number, all these different elements. It was a really long list. This blue line here is the fold of the page. So that was what was below what was present on the screen. This was what was present at first. And then the response options, not at all important to extremely important. So it's a pretty complex grade questionnaire. And then on mobile, this is what it looks like. Each item, what do we want to call this? Each component, right? Each element that we wanted them to respond to was its own little block. And then if you clicked on this little arrow, then your response options appeared and you can select your response options. So we conducted both cognitive testing and usability testing, but learned different things. So in cognitive testing, we're assessing, do people understand when we say things your friends like on Facebook, do people even understand what we're talking about? Are they able to understand that we're interested in knowing how important it is for them to control who could see those specific things? Do they know what those things are that we're questioning about? In usability testing, the objective is more to understand, for us to know if people can accurately record their response. So it's in addition to, do they understand, do they know how to use the instrument? Can they accurately record the responses? And what we learned in usability testing was that on some phones, this is not actually what it looks like. This is not a great screenshot, but it's a screenshot of what actually occurred. So on iPhones, the response options actually appear at the bottom of the phone. This was particularly problematic for people who were not used to completing surveys on their phones. Even if they had been using an iPhone for a long time, they were not used to completing this type of survey question on their iPhone. So some people didn't realize that had shown up at the bottom, and they were thinking aloud, trying to figure out how to use this part of the survey. They kept clicking, not understanding what was going on. We had some people who thought they were going to type in a response option. They just didn't understand how this worked with this, or like I said, some people didn't even see it. We had eye tracking on the study. Some people never even looked down there. So if we had conducted cognitive testing alone, we would have never uncovered this specific usability issue. It was only through usability testing, having people actually complete the survey, use the survey, put in their response options, that we were able to uncover this. So ultimately, what we, recommended was a paging survey where each of these questions, instead of having this massive grid, which looked like this on mobile, it now was a paging survey, and which made it really long. So then we also had different issues where we had a few versions of the survey with different questions on each one, and then we combined them at the end. But again, we would have never figured this out if we had only done cognitive testing, or if we had not conducted usability testing at all. Now, another thing worth spending a moment on is other pre-testing methods. So again, in our field, in survey methodology, we talk a lot about pilot testing, which is different from usability testing. Usability testing is, can people use it? We put it in the hands of the users to assess, can they use it? What are the roadblocks? What can't they do? How do we make that better? How do we make the user's experience better? So ultimately our data quality is good. We've already talked about cognitive testing. Pilot testing is, how does it work in the real world? So that tends to be a larger sample. Usability testing is a small sample. We don't need a lot of people to know that, like the problem I just showed you, we don't need a lot of people to know when there's a usability issue. Pilot testing is a different beast, where we're assessing how things actually work in the real world. In usability testing, we're watching people we're watching them try to achieve specific goals. It could be something like this, which is a form, a survey, a poll, and we're assessing, can people make their selections? Do they accidentally, when they go to make a selection, do they accidentally end up on another page that is not enabling them to do the thing they wanted to do, which in this case was to make a selection here. So we ask people to do real tasks, and then we observe and we record what participants are doing. We do record some verbalizations if people are expressing frustration, if people are telling us what their expectations are, but really we're focused on behavior. Can people complete the tasks? And when they're not able to complete the task, what is going on there? We look across all of our participants, across all of our tasks, and we analyze the data. We diagnose those problems. We assess what's going on, and then ultimately we make recommendations to fix those problems. And then in a perfect world, we're doing iterative testing. So changes are made based on our research, and once those changes are made, we test again to make sure the issues that we found and that we changed, we made changes to the design based on our results. We make sure that the changes are not now introducing new problems, right? So that iterative testing component is really important to make sure we actually fix the problem and we didn't accidentally introduce some new problems. So why is this important in survey research? And I alluded a little bit to this earlier. Our users, our respondents, are usually not trained interviewers. There's not a whole bunch of us out there completing surveys, right? There's a lot of people out there who many are not trained interviewers. So we have these surveys that go out to the general public or even specific parts of the public that are not trained interviewers. And there's varying levels of lots of things, including computer expertise, cell phone expertise, survey expertise. Like the example I showed you with the Facebook study, that had nothing to do with iOS experience, but it was actually completing surveys on iOS that happened to play a role. We have varying levels of literacy. Again, we're asking people to do things for us. They're likely to be in a hurry. They're probably interrupted. They're probably distracted. They're doing something else. They might be trying to complete your survey while they're in line at, Chick-fil-A waiting for their order. And that's when they decide to complete your survey. You just never know what environment people are in. It's often not the environment we think about when we think people are sitting down to complete our surveys. There's also no interviewer present. So nobody there to course correct, to tell people what to do, to tell people how to interpret the question. If somebody has an issue interpreting the question, if somebody has an issue navigating, there's no interviewer present to correct people, to tell them how to use the instrument. So that makes it even more important to conduct usability testing, because these are the things we want to make sure people can do. We want to make sure they interpret the questions. We want to make sure they can navigate and enter in their responses accurately. And if we don't have good surveys, for example, if the surveys don't have clear navigation, if there's not clear ways for people to select responses, if there's not proper spacing so people can tell which responses go with which questions, if there's not clear questions, response options, any of these things, then ultimately we don't get good data. And then, what are we doing all this for? We want to get valid, reliable data. And the worst thing you can do is have bad surveys that we haven't tested that lead to bad data. And then we're making incorrect assumptions based on our bad data. And, I'm sure I don't have to tell you all in the room how bad that is. That's why we're all here, to learn how to conduct, how to create better surveys. Now, some things in life are just designed poorly. You don't need to conduct research to know that this ATM machine is positioned way too high to be usable. And then the same thing goes for surveys. We don't need 9 drop downs to enter a phone number, right? That would be a horrible user experience. We all know this to be true. So we don't always need user testing. Other times things just don't go. People just don't use things in the way that they were designed. So this often happens when a user's goals and a designer's goals or a developer's goals are different. So for example, a designer might create a beautiful physical space in which there are beautiful walkways that intersect, and yet people in a hurry might cut across the grass because it's shorter. So what's happening here is the user's experience and needs don't match what the designer intended, right? And this happens all the time. Another one of my favorite examples is where the visual affordance and the message that the user understands is different from what the designer understood. So here the visual affordance is to pull, but meanwhile the user is supposed to push. Now, oftentimes the user can figure out what to do, they can get around the disparity, but it can be frustrating. And then what happens is, again, leads to Band-Aids. So this is a post office, a real post office, where there are now Band-Aids on the door to help convey the very, very simple function to people, push and pull. But meanwhile, visual affordance is pull, because both of these doors have handles that pull. So we encounter these issues with surveys too. For example, if we allow swiping from side to side to navigate through a survey, this might seem like a way to be engaging. It might seem like a fun way instead of a boring back and next or something like that. We might decide, let's let people swipe because this is fun and people are used to this kind of experience in other products and other applications. But people might inadvertently change their answers and they don't realize it. This actually came from, I know this is just an illustration, but this actually came from a real example from Emily that's in our book, where they had a survey and there was not enough white space. So the objective was to have people swipe to change from question to question, but because there wasn't not enough white space, people would swipe and accidentally change their survey answer. So this can happen when there's really long questions, right? Like it's pretty easy to not have enough white space. But in this example, trying to make it a little more exciting, trying to allow swiping, actually turned out to be quite problematic. I love this quote by Don Norman. He says that good design is actually a lot harder to notice than poor design, in part because good designs fit our needs so well that the design is invisible. So this is important to think about with surveys. You know, when we think about some other products in our environment, we want snazzy, exciting designs. But when it comes to surveys, we really want our respondents to not even notice the design, right? They don't even notice the surveys. They're not noticing the design. They shouldn't have to think to be able to complete our surveys. They should just be able to do them quickly, accomplish their goals of putting in the correct response options, and then move on. Okay, so some tips for some good survey design. So these are not only based on my own experiences, these are based on others as well. I mentioned Emily, some of these are hers. You could read more about them in a book, and some are others that we've discovered. The important thing here is not to remember all these tips and principles, but really to know that design can play a role and to at least think about it when you're designing a survey. So you can hopefully mitigate these things even before going into usability testing, which I hope as a result of this, you will consider usability testing moving forward. So again, I mentioned sometimes we want to do things to make our surveys more exciting, more engaging, more fun. And then we add various design elements to accomplish this, but it doesn't always work out so well. So this was a survey that I had conducted usability testing on many moons ago, where respondents needed to move this little cursor to make their selection, to record their response. And the starting point of that cursor was within this line here. So it's kind of in this area where it was perceived that one never could have been the response. So visually, it was in line where that one never response was. And then in usability testing, we noticed that some people left the cursor there when they wanted to select one never. They were supposed to move that cursor over to make that selection. And if they wanted to select one, they should have moved it over just a tiny bit. Not that they should have. We don't want to blame users, but that's what their expectation was based on what this looked like visually. So this would have caused major trouble from the back end because there may have been a high amount of non-responses, and we would not have been able to tell if they were in fact skipped or if people had selected one never. So we ended up making a very simple recommendation where these turned into classic radio buttons because people understand what those are. And sure, they're not sexy and snazzy, but people understand them. And our goal in surveys is to collect quality data. When designing surveys, it's really important to consider what classic standard web conventions are. Sometimes people will, again, try to change things up because they're being creative, and mixing up things like checkboxes and radio buttons is not the place where you want to test your creativity. People have a mental model. People who have completed surveys in the past, people who know a thing or two about surveys, they have a mental model of how checkboxes and radio buttons work. And you want to make sure your surveys match people's mental models, especially of things like this that are super, super classic. So even without instructions that say select all or select only one, many people, many respondents who encounter these kinds of questions, they know already that checkboxes mean select all that apply and that radio buttons mean select only one. So this is not something you want to mess with. However, it's important to know that checkboxes aren't the only way to capture multiple responses. So another way is to have a yes or no grid over here, which is also referred to as a forced choice grid, because you're forcing respondents to say yes or no to every single option. So numerous studies have found that the forced choice grid on the right-hand side here, where people have to select yes or no for every single item, that this tends to elicit more yes responses than the check all that apply. And there might be a couple of reasons for this. There might be deeper cognitive processing where people have to examine every single item consider every single item. So there's less likelihood of skimming or skipping, which also means these might take a little bit longer. With the select all that apply design, people might choose the options that are most applicable rather than truly selecting all that apply. So, there are trade-offs. If you decide that that's okay, that if people are not actually selecting all that apply, but if they're selecting the ones that are most appropriate, that's okay for our data collection reasons, then that's fine. If you decide that this version is just going to take way too long and we know there's a trade-off, but we're going to go with the checkboxes because it's faster and that's important, that's okay too. The important thing is knowing what those trade-offs are, knowing what the differences are, and then choosing your design appropriately. Now, drop-down menus, we talked about the phone number, totally not appropriate to use drop-down menus with a phone number, but we'll use drop-down menus when we have a long list of items, like if you're asking respondents which state in the United States they live in. The drop-down menus will ensure a number of things. There will be consistency. There will be codable answers like FL for Florida, as opposed to writing out Florida or having some other shorthand version of it, where then it's a lot of work from the back end to recode those all to be consistent. Drop-downs also save a lot of room on web surveys. So the space that this item is taking is just this space, because then it's a drop-down, as opposed to having all of these listed and a radio button where people can only choose one at a time. Drop-downs aren't typically recommended for short lists because the space saved is just not substantial, as you can see here. And it requires more effort to select the drop-down, make a choice, click on next, right? There's a whole bunch of steps there for something that is super simple. So in that case, it would be easier just to have radio buttons. Another thing to consider when you're thinking about drop-down menus is if it's important for people to be able to see all the options. So for something like what state do you reside in, people probably don't need to see all those options because they know in their head what state they're going to be selecting. Their job is just to click on it and make their selection. But if it's the kind of question where people need to be able to see all the options, then that comes into account when you're deciding if you want to use drop-down menus or another method. Open-ended responses. I love open-ended responses. So when using open-ended responses, one of the important things to think about is your text box and what the visual affordance is there. What message are you giving to people with the size of your text box? How much information are you looking for? So for example, if you have a really small box for open-ended responses, the visual story is that you only want a little bit of information. And conversely, if you have a larger box, the visual story is that you want the user to tell you a narrative, that you want more information. The same thing happens with numbers, so that the size of the box is a visual cue to people about what the question is asking. So in this example here, during usability testing of a question about how many people lived at a certain address, the visual story that the box was telling was that more information was requested from the respondents than just a number. So we found in this study that people actually started typing names in there instead of actually giving a number of how many people were at that address at that date. So change that design, and we tailored the text box to fit the expected response, what we were actually seeking from people, and added a label to make it really, really clear. So now they don't have to even go back up here to see what the question is asking. Now it's very clear down here that we're looking for a number, and we even put a number of people down here. So doing these kinds of things, your response box, giving a visual story, but then even adding a little label there can really help provide respondents with these cues that then ultimately help them put in their response option accurately, which then help us make sure we are collecting quality data. And then what about single versus multiple column? Which one do you think is better, single or multiple? Now, designers often are tempted to use a multiple column format, like what we're seeing over here, where you've got some on this side, because it saves space, but it's not always the most usable. And of course, sometimes it is, but not always. The problem with multiple column formats is that the navigation path isn't always clear. So are you supposed to go right first and then down? Are you supposed to go down first and then right? And a bigger problem is that people may miss the second column altogether and they only complete the first problem. So usually single column format is best. There are, of course, some exceptions to the rule, and that's when items kind of go together. You can see here date of birth is all together. Other things like date in general, zip code, when you include the extension, phone number, when it's formatted with 3 boxes, name can be an exception. So just consider what actually goes together versus what doesn't, and don't just universally decide that we're going to have single column or we're going to use double because it saves space. And then instructions on the screen. I loved this study back from 2011. This is one of my early studies at the Census Bureau, where we were assessing. This was actually this wasn't the thing we were assessing, but we learned a lot about instructions on the screen. So this was a national survey of college graduates. What you're looking at here are 6 different eye tracking gaze plots. And then on the right is a heat map across all the participants. And that's basically if you take all of these gaze plots, stuck them on top of each other, and there were a lot more participants in the study, maybe 20 or 30 people. I'm only showing 6 here, but if you take all of those and you aggregate them, you can get a heat map. And this red spot is the hot spots, or the areas that where there were more fixations. The green spots are the areas that had fewer fixations. So like this one here would have shown up like a light green. So anyway, what we learned in this study here, so we gave people a piece of paper. We said, imagine you have been invited to participate in this survey. Here's your letter you received in the mail. Go ahead and log in and do what you normally would do if I wasn't here. You know, there's a little bit more setup there, but that's basically what we did. And we used eye tracking to better understand how people were interacting with various screens. And again, this wasn't the primary goal, but what we learned here was that the very first screen, which is what we're looking at here, the very first screen people interacted with, it contained these login boxes. It's hard to see in this resolution, but there's username and password here. And what we found was that on this first screen, people went right to those boxes. They put in their username, they put in their password, and they moved on. And they never looked at the right side of the screen, which you could see, like this person looked a couple fixations, couple seconds, looked back. This one almost did. This one looked once. This one looked once. They really weren't looking at the right side of the screen at all. And you can see that really clearly here with the aggregate across all of the participants. So they would quickly look, and then they would move on and proceed into the survey. Remember, people are busy. They are able to log in. They're able to get into the survey. That's what they're concerned with. But what we found was that on the very next screen, after people had logged in, there was more information about the survey, and people read this information. Most people, again, you're seeing 6 different people here, lots of fixations. That means people are reading. Over here, you can see the aggregate across a number of participants. People are reading, lots of red, lots of hot spots here. So they were missing important information on that first screen, but once they got into the survey, they were reading additional information. So one way to encourage people to read is to place the instructions, the introduction on a separate screen. Give them a way to get into the survey, but don't have that extra information on that first screen, because again, people are busy. They're here to complete the survey. They get into the survey and then move on. That will increase the likelihood that people read. Now, not everybody reads, right? Some people will get to the screen and they'll keep on moving. But what we noticed in this study was it was really robust, that first screen people were missing altogether. It ended up being problematic because there were some sensitive questions later in the survey. And when people encountered those, they were asking why those questions were being asked. But the information about why there were going to be sensitive questions in the survey was actually on the first page. So we made recommendations to move that information later, like on the second page, which is what we're looking at here. Okay, so that's a little bit about design. I wanted to share some tips for good survey questions, because The design of questions also plays a role in users' experience. And then, of course, ultimately on the quality of our data, which we're very concerned with. And sometimes these are cognitive issues, but sometimes they're usability issues as well. So leading questions, a huge issue I often see, no matter how long people have been in the field, inevitably leading questions are still really, really problematic. Leading questions are when we're leading respondents to a certain response. They encourage a certain answer. So for example, do you like this module? It makes it way too easy for people just to say yes, and that's all. We're leading them because we're asking if they like the module. Instead, if we ask, to what extent did you like or dislike the module? Now we're no longer leading people to respond about how they like the module, but now we're asking about how much they like or dislike the module. We have some variability in our response options as well. Number 2, middle means typical. So when writing questions, it's not just the words that matter, but also what they look like on the screen, the visual design. And when ordinal response options are provided, respondents assume that the middle means typical or average. This is the conceptual midpoint. It's the visual midpoint. People think this means something in the middle. They think this means average. In this example, the conceptual midpoint and the visual midpoint are the same, but what happens when we introduce a couple other response options like don't know and no opinion? So now the conceptual midpoint and the visual midpoint are no longer aligned. And research has shown that the misalignment between the conceptual and the visual midpoint, what we're looking at here, it skews responses towards the bottom of the scale. And that makes sense when you think about that visual midpoint. And if people are in general thinking that the middle means typical, now that visual midpoint is typical. So now our responses are going to be skewed lower. So what should we do? So one thing to consider is whether or not you need a don't know or, similar kind of option. Is that even necessary? Do you want to force people to make a decision? Is it okay to allow people to choose don't know or no opinion? When don't know is shown, more people tend to choose it. They don't want to make a decision. So that's something to consider too. How important is it to have more data that is not don't know? If more people are going to select don't know, do you even want to allow them to do that? They might be needed with certain questions. So like factual questions, I see don't know used a lot when we're asking people about their opinion. And maybe that's not a great use of it, but if it's a factual question, maybe people genuinely don't know and we want to give them that option. So, with certain fact questions or knowledge questions, such as who is the attorney general? Like people may not actually know that information. So giving them a way to respond is important. But another thing you can do, so if you do have to include don't know or similar options, you can add some sort of visual separation. So in this example, there's a line here that now separates those options from the top options. Now that neither like or dislike, again, the conceptual midpoint and visual midpoint are now equal again, because we've separated those response options down below. Now, this isn't always an option depending on the software you're using to create your surveys. So that's another thing to think about when you're considering survey design. And if something like this is really important to you, then that might be a factor that goes into the survey design software you're choosing, right? Like if this is really problematic and you really need to have that conceptual midpoint and visual midpoint be the same, and you really need to have a don't know option, then that's one of the things to consider when you're thinking about software to invest in. Okay, next, response options should be exhaustive and mutually exclusive. So what do we mean by that? By exhaustive, we mean they should cover all possible options. So for example, when asked in a typical month, how many times do you go to the grocery store, where the response options are 1 to 2 times, 2 to 4 times, more than 4, there's no way for the respondent to indicate that they don't typically go to the grocery store. And then the other thing to be careful of is overlapping response options. So with the same example, how would someone respond if they go to the store approximately 2 times a month? There's 2 different options there that have 2 in them. So you want to be careful with that and make sure that each answer choice is discrete. And then what about if the person goes approximately 4 times. Again, here there's 2 response options where they can choose 4 times. And presumably more than 4 times means 5 times, right? But at a quick glance, when a respondent is looking at this, that distinction might not be clear. So you want to avoid even the perception of overlapping responses, even though that might look like more than 4 equals 5, but we've got the number 4 twice on the screen. So instead, we can have a design like what we see on the right. In a typical month, how many times do you go to the grocery store? 0, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 or more times. Another favorite, do not ask double-barreled, triple-barreled, quadruple-barreled questions. So what this means is there's multiple concepts in a questions, and then it's really difficult to answer at all or to answer correctly. So for example, in this question here, do you support policies that make private workplaces, restaurants, and standalone bars smoke-free? If a respondent supports policies that makes standalone bars smoke-free, but not those other places, there's no way for them to select that, right? And vice versa. So you really want to separate these different components and ultimately end up with 3 different questions where people can now answer every single question accurately. And then open-ended. We talked about open ends and the size of the box and how that tells a story. But in general, you don't want to ask too many open-ended questions. Open-ended questions can give us such rich data. I love open-ended questions. But when you've got a large sample, this is a lot of coding that you need to conduct from the back end. So sometimes we start with open-ended questions, and in some of our pre-testing, we might have open-ended questions, but then in a large scale survey, we then convert those responses in the open ends, we convert them into closed ends, and then in our larger survey, we actually have closed-ended questions instead of the open ends. So keep in mind what you need to do from the back end. The other thing is we often lose respondents when there's too many open-ended questions, because again, people are busy. They're off doing their own thing. They want to come in, complete that survey, and carry on doing whatever it is they were doing that day. Their goal is not to provide you, a really lengthy description of what happened when the app crashed. They want to be able to do that really quickly. So allow them to do it quickly, and then also prevent you or your team all of that work from the back end of having to recode all those open-ended questions. All right, so a little recap here. Some takeaways. If there's only a couple things you take away from our time together here today, number 1, you are not your user, and it's impossible for us to know how other people use our products. So what do? We want to invest in usability testing. Usability testing is about measuring behavior. It's different from cognitive testing. There's a lot of cognitive testing, especially in government. There's a lot of cognitive testing and not as much usability testing, although we are quite fortunate that there's quite a bit. But it's not the same thing. Remember that usability testing is measuring behavior. Can people use the thing? Cognitive testing is, do they understand what we're even asking? We're measuring comprehension. We're doing this with real people who represent real users, and we're testing in the real context of use. We're not testing that pen in a swimming pool. We're putting people at a desk. We're telling them to imagine the scenario, and then we're testing in that context of use. If it's a kind of survey that they're going to be using while they're in a drive-through or waiting at the DMV or, standing in line somewhere, then we want to put them in that mental space when we're testing our products. And then ultimately follow some of these known design principles. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you're creating a survey. There's some, I just scratched the surface here, but there's so many design principles about survey design and about question design. So follow those. You don't have to start from scratch. Follow those for both survey design and question design, and you'll be off to a great start. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much.